Inflation is low. I think it's important to keep in mind that with the slack in the economy, it probably will stay that way. Unemployment at 9.5 or 9.7% as of this last recently reported number is exceedingly high, but what is also not appreciated is if you take what they call the underemployment index, which includes all of the people that are working less than full-time. They're working, but they're not getting all the hours they want, not through their choice, but by virtue of their employer. We are close to 17% of the population is working less than full-time right now, either not working or less than full-time. As a result, inflation probably won't be a big issue, with one caveat. Because we have simply too much slack in the economy, we're still moving jobs overseas where it's cheaper. And as a result, the prime driver in inflation isn't really raw materials, it's the employment cost that goes into manufacturing products. There's too much slack in the economy. We're not really concerned about inflation unless we end up with some sort of dollar meltdown, which various people are speculating on from time to time. We don't think that's imminent. We're not saying it's impossible, just not imminent. So all the caveats that we've talked about so far roll together, and basically with a sense that with the kind of circumstances we've got with very low rates, we can't stimulate. We have a huge amount of private sector debt. We have a huge amount of total economic debt. We're at 175% of GDP for the private sector of the economy. Now, that is all non-financial private sector debt. So it doesn't count banks because they turn around and relend it, and it warps the calculations. It's all consumer debt, all corporate debt that isn't bank debt. This percentage has been rising steadily over the last 50 years. At 175%, it's about, it was 100% a little over 20 years ago. In most of the late 80s, we were in the 120% of GDP range. We're at 175%. That's the highest we've been. And it simply puts too much of a burden on the consumer to come back out and spend when they're trying to figure out how to service that amount of debt. Total U.S. debt, when you include the rest of the financial debt and the federal debt, state and municipal as well as federal, we're at 375% total debt to GDP. This is an amazing number because for all of the talk about the Japanese lost decade and the problems with them not figuring out how to stimulate their economy appropriately, they peaked at about 348% of total system debt to GDP back in, they ran pretty high at that for a long time into the late 80s and early 90s, but at the peak of their borrowing propensities back in the late 90s, they were literally at 350% of GDP. We're at 375. So you look at where they were at, you talk about all of the things they did wrong to not successfully stimulate their economy. If you have enough debt on your balance sheet, whether you're a consumer or the federal government, you only really have two options to eliminate that debt. You either file bankruptcy or you eat an awful lot of spaghetti. And the reality is we are facing the spaghetti economy. You can call it new normal. I call it the spaghetti economy because that's all anybody can afford out there these days. And I think when you also look at what's happening from government spending, whether it's normal traditional transfer payments like Social Security and health care or the add-ons that we've got, we're now putting almost $1 trillion of incremental debt on the federal balance sheet on an annual basis. This is a $14 trillion economy. So we're adding 7% of our total GDP to our debt every year. At some point, there is no way to resolve that if you keep piling it on except to break the bank somehow. So it's a challenging environment. It isn't going to go away. I think ultimately the implication is tax rates will go up for most Americans. That's just a graphic picture of what I was talking about. So you can see before the mania started to build in about housing and trading them and buying 4 or 5 and the like, we were running 120% of private sector debt to GDP. At 175, to work that back down a few percent a year assuming that 120 is a reasonable proxy for the norm, and I don't honestly know what the norm is, but I'll accept that as closer than 175. You take 5% of that debt off annually and take that out of GDP because you're not buying stuff, you're paying down the debt. It's pretty hard to grow this economy at 3% a year. So for those folks that are talking about a normal recovery as we progress into this year, and the third quarter GDP is probably going to be a couple of percent, but the odds are pretty good the fourth quarter GDP will be weaker again. May or may not be negative. I don't think anybody really knows. I think as a result, when you start thinking about, missed one. When you start thinking about how do I invest going forward, you have to start with the assumption that the recovery is going to suffocate. Whether you want to argue about a W or an L as the norm for the letter describing the economic recovery, it's going to be listless at best, and without the federal government, it's not clear it's going to be anything other than dead flat. I think we'll see this gradual recapitalization. We've seen some meaningful steps on the part of consumers to pay down their installment debt. They're reducing that debt at the rate of about 4% a year, but that's only a small percentage of their total debt. So they will continue to do that. They probably won't show up routinely. And from our point of view, you just don't invest in the American consumer in equity portfolios right now because they probably just won't bring what people are counting on. And we're frankly quite amazed at how some of the retailers have rallied as much as they have. With so many fewer consumers working, with real wages declining at almost a 5% annual rate. That's the first time that's happened since World War II. It's impossible to figure out where spending power comes from. Just plain and simple, people are making less. The only reason personal income numbers show up is because the government is providing incremental financing. And if it weren't for all of that stimulus spending that we're doing and the transfer payments, the welfare, the kickback in tax rebates back about 8 months ago, those are the only kind of things that are giving us any kind of positive income numbers. Real wages in this country are going down. And as long as companies can continue to rebuild their labor force in China or India or Vietnam, I don't frankly think you're going to see a whole lot of those jobs recreated. I think it all boils down to the last line here of this particular slide. The euphoria around this market is tied very heavily to the assumption that the rest of the world will carry the developed world forward. We've got real challenges with that assumption. If you step back and look at GDP percentages of total world GDP, the Chinese are less than 7%. 6.8 is the number for the last year that I saw. The U.S. is roughly 20. The traditionally large countries of Western Europe add up to a little over 20, 21, 22, and Japan is about 8. You throw those three together, you have almost 50% of world GDP in the developed world that is simply not growing very fast. It's inconceivable to me that as big a population as you have in China, that you can actually get 6.8% to drive 50% that's dead in the water in a way that is meaningful for the world economic expansion. We are approaching a tipping point where they are going to be the drivers of economic growth. But quite honestly, it's hard for us to make sense out of a lot of the commodity inflation we've seen in the last several months, trying to jumpstart the assumptions again about how much the Chinese are going to buy. I don't think they can buy enough to offset the weakness in the 50% of the GDP that's in the developed world.